fiddle with it. Well, thank you very much for such a generous introduction and for inviting me here. I'm not sure I think my head is swollen so much I won't be able to leave this room tonight. But thank you all for coming. I just realized that this is spring break. So this is really, truly above and beyond the call of everything that you, and on such a beautiful, maybe in DC you have had beautiful afternoons like this for a while, but I think I just flew in from Minnesota where we have had like one like this. So I'm very deeply honored and flattered that you see fit to spend this afternoon indoors listening to me. But what I want to talk to you about today comes from my new book that has a strikingly similar title to the title of the talk. It's called Making Uzbekistan, Nation, Empire, and Revolution in the Early USSR. And so what I want to talk about today is one strand of several arguments that I follow in the book. And if you wanted to acquire the book, I have a discount coupon for anyone interested, please. But so that's my little plug. That's the last time I mentioned the book. But if you've read it, then some of this might be a little bit of an old hat. What I want to present today is a topic of historical interest that nevertheless has contemporary implications of certainly of how we think about Uzbekistan. And the fundamental question is, what is Uzbekistan and where did it come from? Today we are familiar with this map of Central Asia. Okay, on the third prompt, so this is a map that is nicely colored, 5 different stands. And 100 years ago, even 90 years, 100 years ago, it looked very different. It's a period map, but there are no stands. There's one stand. There's Turkestan, which is a governor-generalship of the Russian Empire, and 2 protectorates or khanates under Russian protection. And the names are, they're non-ethnic names attached to territories. And indeed, the ethnic nomenclature of the time was different, and they arguably were quite unstable. We read about Uzbeks, but there were also Sarts, and there were Tajiks, and there were a number of other groups, rather than sort of the 5 or 6 or 7 ethno-national titles that we find in Central Asian time. So what happened, and how did this come about? During the Cold War, excuse me, we were all comfortable with the explanation that the division of Central Asia, of this into the previous map, is a classic story of divided rule. That the Soviets divided some innate natural unity of Central Asia in order to strengthen their own rule. And this is this explanation is a little too beguiling for us to let go, no matter what kind of archival evidence historians bring up. And so, to a certain extent, I've given up actually ever trying to convince people on anything otherwise. But I can read you quotes from specialist literature, but especially from non-specialist literature. That here's all of Carroll writing in 1954, it seemed as if the absurdity of the inter-republic borders was designed in order to compel a certain degree of central direction, making nonsense of real local autonomy. Here's Mali's Reuven, editor of the Historical Atlas of Islam, a British scholar today, writing about 15 years ago, the potential for political solidarity among Soviet Muslims was attacked by a deliberate policy of divide and rule. Central Asian states of today owe their territorial existence to Stalin. Stalin appears large in this. He responded to the threat of pan-Turkish and pan-Islamic nationalism by parceling out the territories of Russian Turkestan into the 5 republics. Stalin's policies demanded that subtle differences in language, history, and culture between these mainly Turkic peoples be emphasized in order to satisfy Leninist criteria of nationality, which required a common language, unified territory, and a common culture. Ahmad Rashid, a Pakistani journalist, writes that Stalin, drew arbitrary boundary divisions, quote, and, quote, created republics that had little geographic or ethnic rationale. Philip Shishkin, a young Russian-American journalist, one-ups and questions. He writes, Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin drew borders that sliced up ethnic groups and made it harder for them to mount any coherent challenge to Soviet rule. If you look at a map of the Fergana Valley, the feverish lines dividing states zigzag wildly, resembling a cardiogram of a rapidly racing heart. And people can get even more inventive, but even amongst professional scholars, I've sat through conference presentations on Stalinist time bombs and drawing borders with knives, etc., etc. Again, all hinting at this deliberate Soviet policy of dividing up this region that was in some way innately unified and singular. Now, of course, this is in complete contrast to current historiography in Central Asia. And again, what all the divided people usually don't actually read, which takes the existence of nations as axiomatic and sees in early Soviet policy as a historically normal process of nationalization and state building. Central Asian scholars who criticize the process do so mostly for the mistakes and the incorrect decisions that it involved, whether they were deliberate or otherwise, that gave lands belonging to one nation to another, but they do not really see it as a fraudulent enterprise. Indeed, archivally grounded research has clearly shown the delimitation, the national territorial delimitation of 1924, that was the process that created or turned this into this, was part of a pan-Soviet process of creating ethnically homogeneous territorial entities. Research has also shown that local cadres, local communists, played a central role in the debates over the delimitation, and that the Soviets saw the main problem in Central Asia to be not its some innate unity that frightened them, but its political fragmentation, which needed to be consolidated into ethnically homogeneous territories. This, more generally, our understanding of Soviet nationalities policy, the assumptions behind it, and the forms of its implementation has been transformed over the last 2 decades. The Cold War assumption that nationalities policy was a sham, a thinly veiled cover for policies of Russification and anti-nationalism have been basically turned on their head with the works of Terry Martin, Yuri Sloskin, Francine Hirsch, and Roger Sooney, Ron Sooney, and many others. We now know that the Soviets took nations to be ontological givens and considered it a political imperative to accord to make sure that administrative and ethnic or national boundaries coincided. More sophisticated accounts of Central Asia's delimitation have emphasized the importance of classificatory projects, of ethnographers, and of the Soviet state. And we see, and they've tied it to broader processes of ethnographic classification and the disciplining of state power, etc., that can be found in many, many other places. So there are two different contexts of that. One is the pan-Soviet one. So that, in fact, Central Asia was the last part of the Soviet Union where the ethno-territorial principle was implemented. That by 1924 it was a sign of Central Asia's lagging behind the rest of the Soviet Union, that its internal political boundaries did not accord with ethnic. The creation of Belarus, the creation of Ukraine, but the delimitation of the former Transcaucasian Krai into Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan, that was actually done not by the Soviets at all, but in 1918 and 19 by those republics themselves. That had all happened. So what came to Central Asia in 1924 was the implementation of the pan-Soviet. That Soviet principle, again, bears striking similarities to what happened to the land of the Habsburg Empire in the aftermath of World War I. That too saw a national territorial delimitation. We don't call it by that name, but how Hungary and Romania and Czechoslovakia came to be nationally homogeneous nation states is the result of very similar understandings of the relationship between ethnicity and state power and state consolidation. So we need to keep that in mind. But the literature on Soviet nationalities policy that I was referring to just now has been salubrious. It has taken attention, it has forced us to focus on the assumptions of the Soviets, of the Bolsheviks. And they are real, they're important. However, it still nevertheless ends up leaving indigenous actors out of consideration. So instead of seeing this as deliberate divide and conquer by a malicious Soviet regime, now we have a tendency to see this basically as a rather more benevolent Soviet project, but nevertheless a Soviet project, the work of Soviet ethnographers and Soviet census takers and map makers and ultimately Soviet museum makers as well. So the map census and museum that Benedict Anderson sort of talked about as fundamental to the creation of forms of nationhood, of how we imagine community. Well, in the accounts that we have of the revisionist accounts of Soviet nationalities policy, all end up being Soviet projects. So what I argue in the book is that that is also a somewhat simplistic understanding of the situation, especially when it comes to Uzbekistan. That Uzbekistan is not simply a creation, is not simply a Soviet project, whether it's divide and conquer or whether it's based on a Soviet understanding of the ontological reality of nations. That Uzbekistan today, that what we see in these boundaries, was the project, is the result of a project of the pre-revolutionary Muslim intelligentsia Central Asia of the Jadid, that was carried out, or was that they managed to pull off in the context of Soviet policies of national delimitation. But the imagining of Uzbekistan, the imagining of Uzbekness, and even the creation of the boundaries of Uzbekistan were not simply the work of Soviet ethnographers or Soviet census takers. This is really ultimately a project of the pre-revolutionary Muslim intelligentsia of Central Asia. The idea of the nation had arrived in Central Asia before the revolution. But it was the revolution with this boundless promise of opportunity that planted the nation firmly at the center of the Central Asian intelligentsia's passions. The revolution also reshaped the way in which the nation was imagined. Up until 1917, Central Asian intellectuals sort of imagined the community to be the Muslims of Turkestan. That was sort of, it was a confessional, a regionally bounded, but nevertheless a confessional understanding of the nation. That it's understood in that was that all these people are not nomads. So it's the sedentary Muslim population of Turkestan was sort of the label around which political action took place before 1917. In 1917, however, what we see a stark emergence, almost an explosion of an ethnicization of this identity, the emergence of a Turkestan-centered Turkism. That's how I like to phrase it. So it's Turkist in the sense that instead of the Muslims of Turkestan, the new understanding becomes that the Muslim population of Central Asia, Turkestan and Bukhara is important, I'll come to that, the Muslim population is actually Turkic, they're Turks. And they should take pride in the fact that they are Turks, and take pride in that Turkic heritage. A lot of writers sort of lost this in Pan-Turkey. There's nothing Pan about this. I think this is Turkism. It's centered in Central Asia itself. It does not aspire to conquer other Turkic or join with other Turkic lands, nor does it want to be joined by them. The Central Asian Turkists see fraternity and brotherhood with other Turkic populations, but the logic of the Central Asian centered Turkism does not lead to political unity. It is Turkist, however, in that it displaces other ways of imagining the community. So I think that the distinction between Turkism and Pan-Turkism is important to make, and we solipsistically often don't make that enough. And here, what you have then is a rather remarkable explosion of Turkist rhetoric once the Russian autocracy falls and the freedom of the press is declared, newspapers appear, and all of a sudden you have a very different tenor in the press. The central figure in all of this is my goodness, wait. Sorry, this has gone out of order. Good. All right. Sorry. How I usually listens to me.
F5.
Really very sorry about that. So I just want to spend all that time putting these things together. I just want you to see. So Abdul Fitrat is the main figure. He's the main character in my book. He was born in Bukhara in 1886, and his first language was Persian. He wrote only in Persian until 1960. In 1909, well before the revolution, he went to Istanbul to study. And there was a small number of Bukharan students being sent to Istanbul. Because Istanbul was the seat of the Caliphate, the capital of the strongest, most powerful sovereign Muslim state of the time. Not because of any Turkic connections, but while he was there, Fitrat picked up the idea of Turkism. He picked up the idea of progress, of the necessity of self-strengthening, and the understanding that that self-strengthening can only happen through the nation, and the nation has to be ethnic. And this is the 4 years that Fitrat spent in Istanbul between 1909 and 1913 were absolutely crucial. These are tumultuous years of tumultuous political debate after the Constitutional Revolution of 1908, and where all of these ideas about identity, what forms of solidarity would best ensure the survival of the state, of the Ottoman state, were current. Fitrat was fully immersed in all of that, and he picked up some very significant ideas there. And it was these that, when opportunity arose in 1917, he then began to talk about for Central Asia itself. Here, in 1917, in July, well, in Bukhara, the Emir saw the revolution as an opportunity to actually extend his power and get himself liberated from the Russian yoke. And that meant actually clamping down on any reform. The reformers, like Fitrat, wanted the Emir of Bukhara to implement change, and this is where there's a massive falling out between the reformers and the Emir who represented the old order. And that had a lot to do with radicalizing the reformers. Fitrat fled into exile in Turkestan, and in Samarkand he began writing for a newspaper. In July he writes a poem called Sorrows of the Homeland that says, "O great Turan, land of lions, what happened to you? What state are you in? What days have fallen upon you? O glorious cradle of Chingiz's, Timur's, Oghuz's, and Attila's." It sounds much better in Uzbek. But he's invoking Chingiz, Timur, Oghuz, and Attila. How did you fall into the pit of your slavery? So the great Turan here was the homeland of the Turks, the birthplace of world conquerors, and the center of world empires whose recent misfortunes had to be remedied. And 1917, the Russian Revolution, not Bolshevism, the Russian Revolution, the liberties provided by the February Revolution were the chance to reclaim that lost glory. But in order to do that, Muslims had to understand had to embrace the nation. They had to understand their own actual self, recognize that their innate Turkicness and the Muslimness that did not go away. But here, basically, the Russian Revolution provided the opportunity for the Turks of Central Asia to take their place again in the world as Turks. In the 4-year, so Fitrat moves here from Bukhara or Central Asia to Turan as the seat of his political imagination. And the ethnicization of that is absolutely clear. In the poem I just quoted, the pre-Islamic Attila rubbed shoulders with Oghuz Khan, the mythical bringer of Islam to the Turks. And Chinggis Khan, the non-Muslim conqueror who ravished many Muslim states and destroyed the caliphate, with the Muslim Timur. What they had in common was their birth in Turan and their ostensibly common ethnicity. Eventually, however, Chinggis Khan was very problematic. Even though actually the memory of Chinggis had been indigenized in Islamic, in Muslim societies for centuries, and had been sort of just like Alexander the Great, he had been turned into an Islamic hero. Nevertheless, he was a difficult person to glorify too much. The winter of 1917-1918, there were plays about Chinggis Khan that were staged in Tashkent and so on and so forth. Timur, on the other hand, was much easier because he is the inheritor of the nomadic traditions of the Mongols. He's also Muslim, and he's the creator of a world empire that was centered not in the Mongol steppe but in Samarkand, and his court saw the creation of a high culture and a high literary language of Chagatai. So in my book I call this a Chagataist understanding of Uzbek identity. And the term was actually used in the 1920s, so this is Chagataism that you you find as the node of your identity, the coming together of worldly power and high culture and Islam and Turkicness in the Timurid dynasty. And it was here that, so this is how Fitrat came to, and not only Fitrat came to formulate a sense of who the nation was. But the inheritors of Timur was the sedentary Muslim population of Central Asia. They were the nation who came to be called Uzbek, not Chagatai. The term Uzbek had been in use before the revolution by Russians sometimes, but also in Turkic usage as well. But after 1917, that became basically the standard term for referring to the Central Asian Muslim population, sedentary Central Asian Muslim population. So anyone that was, the nomads were different. Kazakhs were Kazakhs, and the Kyrgyz were Kyrgyz, and the Turkmen were Turkmen. But the unmarked sedentary Muslim population came to be called Uzbek. All right, so that's one thing. The other term that happened here was the reimagination of Bukhara as the inheritor of Timur. In some ways, it's not completely far-fetched, but Bukhara was the last example of Central Asian Islamic state in Central Asia that had survived in some form under Russian protection. The falling out between the emir and the reformers in 1917 only got worse and worse, and in 1920, also the emir's relationship with the Bolsheviks also plummeted. It wasn't always bad. In 1919, they were actually the emir was selling him large amounts of cotton and grain to the Soviets. But in 1920, Mikhail Frunze decided that that situation cannot go on, and the Red Army invaded Bukhara, ousted the emir. But for both practical and tactical and strategic purposes, they put Bukharan reformers in charge of the government. So there was a party of the young Bukharans. There's a very infinitesimal Bukharan Communist Party. Frunze forced them to merge. The young Bukharans, people like Fitrat and his friend, became the dominant partners in this so-called Bukharan Communist Party and came to power. So the Bolsheviks actually put these Islamic reformers in power in Bukhara in September of 1920. But now for Fitrat and for the Chagatai project, Bukhara was also the inheritor in some ways of Timurid state of the Timurid state tradition. And so in 1920, and one of the major projects of the young Bukharan government in the 3 years that they had the run of the state was a policy of, they did many things, but one of them was the policy of the Turkification of Bukhara. So the language of literature, the language of the chancery of the government in Bukhara had been Persian all along. And Fitrat himself had sort of grown up with Persian, but this understanding that Central Asians are Turks, they should speak their own language, led Fitrat himself to switch from Persian to Uzbek after 1917, and then to declare Uzbek to be the state language of Bukhara immediately upon the young Bukharans taking power. So that was already in progress. Then in the very end of 1923, the Soviets decided to initiate the process of national territorial delimitation in Central Asia to sort of sort out these people, that people are too mixed up, and let's put them all in homogeneous national republics. And when that possibility arose, it was not the Republic of Turkestan, but it was the Republic of Bukhara that jumped at the opportunity to establish in Uzbekistan. So Uzbekistan, in some ways, you can say, argue is the heir to Bukhara more than to Turkestan, even though we don't usually think of it that way, because Tashkent is the capital of Turkestan and Tashkent is the capital of Uzbekistan, but in interesting ways. So Fitrat's this friend and disciple Fazlullah Hojayev wrote a policy brief for the National Territorial Commission in 1924 that outlined what Uzbekistan should do. And I'll quote that at some length. Bukhara will be the basis for the construction of the Uzbek Republic. Uzbekistan will unite Bukhara, except for the left bank of Amudarya Fergana, Sirdarya Oblast, excluding its Kazakh parts, Samarkand Oblast, and Khwarezm, except for regions inhabited by Turkmens and Kazakhs. So no interest in people of nomadic heritage, but it includes all the territory inhabited by the sedentary population of Transoxiana, of Central Asia. This territory would also incorporate all the historic cities of the region. This was the Chagataist vision of Uzbek history, laid out in territorial terms. The document then presents a narrative of how the nation of the Uzbeks, and it's a very strange formulation, it's Narod Uzbekov, it says in Russian, and how it has seen dark times. The Uzbek people, in recent history, the Uzbek people, earlier united in the state of Timur, and his successors, disintegrated in recent centuries into various parts. He means Kokand and Bukhara. Over the course of centuries, this disintegration was characterized by the weakening of economic forces and of political structures. The final stage of which is the economic decomposition, the loss of state unity, and the physical destruction of the people under the domination of Khanis, Emirates, and Tsarism. This unity meant that, quote, the Turkic population could not historically resist its gradual disintegration or defend the unity of the people, the integrity and continuity of its culture. The Uzbek people and its various states, Bukhara and Khiva, were thrown off the basic historical path and became the object of struggle between the British and the Russian Empire. So Fazl Hojayev here asserts that the Timurid state was the national state of the Uzbeks. Might have been news to Timur, but that is the national state of the Uzbeks, a key Chagataist point, and sees the loss of a unified state as the cause of decline. So the disintegration of the state causes decline, cultural backwardness, and even exploitation by the outsiders. This then provides the link to Soviet considerations, because he is writing for a Soviet audience. The revolution, he says, has put the Uzbek people at a new stage of historical development, laying the foundations of economic growth, and simultaneously emphasized all aspects of the cultural national order. Yet the continuation of the old divisions imposed by force on Central Asia by its conquerors, that is, the administrative boundaries drawn by the Tsarist order, the boundaries of Turkestan and Bukhara, produced national conflict between the sedentary population on the one hand and its nomadic and semi-nomadic neighbors on the other. It was necessary, therefore, to give all people bearing a single name on a national basis according to the specificities of their way of life and economic habits their own Soviet political units, which would then be able to undertake integral economic and cultural work. So Fazlullah Khojaev has made re-establishing the national unity of the Uzbek people and their statehood into a significant task of the Soviet task of the Soviet Revolution to actually put the Uzbeks back together. And this, again, I think what this document really, on the one hand, it's of course very much a product of its time and its place, but it gives us some very clear indications of what was, how Uzbekness was being imagined by Uzbek authors, by Uzbek actors at this time. And here you don't really have any appeal to, certainly not Marx, but even an appeal to sort of the kind of ethnographic expertise of professional ethnographers is largely lacking. What you have is a historical argument for Uzbekness, cast largely in indigenous terms. This claim actually largely won out. And so the Uzbekistan that was created in 1924 is actually rather different than it looks today, because, well, Tajikistan and Gorno-Badakhshan were autonomous parts of Uzbekistan, but Pakistan was not. And there were other areas here that went to Turkmenistan that were then later ceded back. Khiva here is an exclave. It's actually the former, the sedentary part of the former Khanate of Khiva is an exclave that's not actually connected to Uzbekistan. But what it does have, what this Uzbekistan does have, are all the historic cities of Central Asia. Okay. So Jalalabad and Osh went to Kyrgyzstan. There was a Soviet argument made in all sorts of other contexts that quote-unquote backward economically backward places need urban centers, even if they are ethnically different. That the composition of cities often, the ethnic or national composition of cities often differed from their hinterland. Kiev was largely Russian, or Riga was German, its hinterland was Estonian. But Stalin and Soviet nationality experts figured that that will become normalized and cities will take on the national and ethnic character of their surroundings because of laws of economic growth and so on and so forth. So Osh and Jalalabad went to Kyrgyzstan, and Tashao's small town went to Turkmenistan, but otherwise Uzbekistan had all the cities of Central Asia. So again, the imagination of Uzbeks as the inheritors of the sedentary Muslim population of Central Asia is actually fulfilled here. The other map that I have in my book, in a much better form, is the relationship between Bukhara as it existed after the protectorate and Uzbekistan. So Bukhara is and what the national delimitation in some ways did was to actually add all the cities of Transcaucasia, Bukhara, under the name of Uzbekistan. Again, other than Osh and Jalalabad falls off and Turkestan, I suppose. But this is, again, the sedentary Muslim population of Central Asia being reimagined as Uzbekistan to the benefit of Bukhara, which is, again, was imagined as the inheritor of Islamic statehood in Central Asia. So these are some of the, and ultimately that Uzbekistan is then the successor state of Bukhara rather than of Turkestan, much of which was inhabited by Turkmens or Kazakhs in the CERIA, that in the CERIA oblast of Turkestan. So, anyway, so ultimately the point here is that it's impossible to imagine Uzbekistan simply as a Soviet project. The Soviets actually did not really have a stable ethnic nomenclature. While the national delimitation was going on, there was no clear-cut, agreed-upon understanding of the ethnic composition of Central Asia. There is a piece that appeared in Novi Vostok, the New East Soviet ethnographic journal, a Soviet academic journal written by Vladimir Kun, published in 1925 after the national delimitation was over, where he basically said that the ethnic composition of, meaning as far as Russian ethnographers were concerned, is completely uncertain and we don't know who belongs to what. So, but the process of the national territorial delimitation was already accomplished. The major actors in it, as Arne Haugen showed 15 years ago in a book called The Establishment of National Republics in Central Asia, as I've written about, as Adrian Edgar has written about, that when the territorial debates happened in 1974, there were very few Soviet ethnographers present. It was national communists who identified themselves as Uzbeks or Kazakhs or Turkmens who actually fought it out. So it's not primarily a Soviet project. The authors of Uzbekistan were the pre-revolutionary Muslim intelligence in Central Asia, who, nevertheless, Soviet conditions are not irrelevant. If the Soviets had not decided to undertake national territorial delimitation in 1924, things would have been very different. If the Soviet understanding of nationalities was different than what it was, it would have been very different. So that's what you get for taking indigenous actors seriously in the history of Central Asia. One last point, and then I'll stop talking. So what are the contemporary implications of all of that, for this understanding of the origins of Uzbekistan? In 1991, a lot of people were surprised when Timur emerged as the symbol of independence, as the node for identity of independent Uzbekistan, and his statue should replace that of Marx in Tashkent Central Square. Well, perhaps they should have been surprised. Uzbekness was imagined in the early 20th century, and and Timur was a central figure in that. Timur didn't sit well with Soviet sensibilities, and for much of the Soviet period, his name could not really be invoked. But nevertheless, what emerged in 1991, or in the very late Gorbachev years, was a return to these understandings of Uzbek identity, or rather those were always there, but with the removal of Soviet constraints on the expression of that. There's also incessant talk of the weakness of new states and of their identities, that all the towns of Central Asia aren't somehow real countries because they're all made up and they have no historical roots and so on and so forth. And I would suggest that those two are need to be modulated. I think on the one hand, they're no natural countries. Countries aren't, God given. All countries are a product of history and of nation and state building processes. So to say that some are real and these are not is ahistorical and not very worthy to say that. But even beyond that, the Central Asian states, like all the other post-Soviet states, didn't just emerge out of absolute nothing in 1991. That these identities had been around. They had to fit within Soviet limits and Soviet constraints, but nevertheless, they had Uzbekness in this case, but also the Ukrainianness, Georgianness had been celebrated throughout much of the Soviet period. And whether you want to talk about the notion of banal nationalism, as Michael Billig does, or just a very existing real relevance, saliency of national labels during the Soviet period, or the celebration of national heritages through state-funded, Soviet-funded academies of sciences and all of that, and publishing industries. These identities were not brand new in 1999. They had Uzbekness was at least 70 years old. And it is that that creates a storehouse of legitimacy that the British government has used. It's not completely concocted, any of that. And finally, I think Uzbekistan in some ways is also unusual from the other stands in that the other Central Asian states, in that it claims the heritage not of the Uzbek nomads of Shebani Khan, which a lot of people still seem to think have some connection to Uzbekistan, but of the entire heritage of Islamic in Central Asia, of its political and its high cultural traditions. So Uzbeks see themselves as heirs to that, and to all the non-nomadic parts, all the sedentary parts of Central Asia. And that, again, I think we need to understand that as well. All right, I'm afraid I never got around to writing a very nifty ending for this paper, so I've run out of things to say, so thank you very much.